Hi, everybody. Hey, it's me again. I'm trying to get these things kind of back to back. Okay, so if it looks like I'm all doing the same thing I just did, because I am, but now I'm going to go through chapter one a little bit. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen. Oh, hold on. Before I do that, I need to come over here. And now I can go ahead and share my screen. There we go. And share screen. Good. With my vital source. Here we go. There you go. Chapter one. So chapter one of this book, it's really kind of a history chapter. It's an introduction to the Linux operating system. So it's going to talk a little bit about and stuff. What is Linux and how did it get started? What are software license agreements? Because that's really important, because the people who came together said, hey, we want to create this operating system that we can share it with a lot of people. We do want to retain a little bit of control, but we're not out there to look to make a lot of big profit. Okay, and so that's one of the things that's kind of different from, say, Microsoft company or Apple, where you don't buy the operating system Apple, you have to buy the hardware, and then they're kind enough to give you the operating system. Okay, again, when it talks about laptops and desktops and stuff, operating systems, a lot of us and stuff look towards Linux as a, because it's it doesn't cost much, or it doesn't cost very little of your time to put it together. Okay, so license agreements and stuff, they're going to talk about that. Some common features, common operating systems that are out there, of course, Windows. Now, this is an older book, so it says Windows 7, but it doesn't matter what version of Windows, Windows 7, Windows 10, Windows 8, or whatever and stuff. Mac's got their OSs, just general Linux operating systems, OpenSUSE, exactly, okay, as well. Graphical interfaces, file systems and drivers, and then a little bit of history of Linux, kind of where it came from and who was involved, the GNU project, okay? Some various distributions that are out there, the timelines going back, saying, oh my gosh, okay, how did we get to where we're at? And again, Linus Torvalds and stuff is probably the most important person out of all that. I mean, Stallman did really important things too and stuff, but Linus is where we got the kernel, basically, which is really what started our Linux operating systems off and running, okay? An overview of Susa, okay, which is the operating system. And again, Susa is owned by Novell. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why I'm there. When you look at the basic operating system architecture, we look at hardware, right? That's our physical CPU, motherboard, things like that. On top of that, we run the operating system kernel. On top of that, we might have shells like command line interfaces, FTPs, and whatever, these various shells, like you have a Windows shell nowadays, whatever. And then on top of that, we usually put a GUI, right? A graphical user interface for the operating systems. And then on top of that, we do things like browsers and other applications that we layer on top of that environment. So again, as you're reading through this chapter, that's the Linux architecture, much like the Windows architecture that you would learn about, okay, from a Windows class. So it's going to go through the chapter here and break down and kind of give more detailed environments. When you look at a desktop, remember, they don't assume that you've had computer classes before. So it's going to start off with its basic environment. And in this case, for SUSE Linux and stuff, you have like two different interfaces that you could choose from, the graphical interfaces, the KDE or the GNOME, okay, or GNOME, however you want to say it, whatever. KDE is probably the most popular one that's out there. It's kind of one that we do a lot of, but again, it's like a browser. Sure, Firefox looks a little bit different than Microsoft Edge or Google. It's just a browser, icons, desktop, start bars, whatever. I think the KDE looks a little bit more like Windows, which is one of the reasons why I encourage people to use KDE more, because it has a little bit more of a feel to it, and especially with the taskbar, things like that. Okay, file structures, just like there was file structures in Microsoft. The ability to have multiple users and multitaskings, again, things that you probably read about in CIT12 and 15. That's kind of important. Okay, and then again, various command shells. Now, the one big cool thing about shells, let's put that in terms of Windows. In Microsoft Windows, you were using Windows 10 perhaps, and you were using the what we call DOS shell. We were using command CMD, and that was the shell for Windows 10. Okay, and then when you had Windows 9 or Windows 8, or you had Windows 7, or you had Windows XP, or whichever, they all had very different DOS shells, okay? And you could kind of say, hey, we only work with one at a time, right? Whatever Windows version you have, that's the DOS shell you got, okay? Well, Linux is very interoperable, meaning that it's meant to design to work with a lot of different features that are out there, or software or programs out there, including operating systems. And one of those common threads are the shells. So if you learned what was called the bash shell, or you learned the Bourne shell, okay, kind of like if you learn the CMD or command shell for Windows 7, and then you're all of a sudden put in front of a Windows 10. Well, in Linux, you could opt, even though you're running Windows 10, to run the Windows 7 shell. Microsoft wouldn't let you do that, okay? But Linux will. So this way, even though you may be using a different Linux version, a lot of times you can change the basic command shells to use the one that has programs or one you feel more comfortable with to run this stuff in the back end as a power user, okay? So again, when we look at those kind of shells that are out there, these are just a few short versions of C shell, corn shell, whatever stuff. There's a whole bunch of them out there. So again, chapter 1 is very, very straightforward stuff, very introductory. It's not very long. It's meant to kind of give you the kind of the basics, right? So chapter 14 was prepare for an installation. Chapter 1 was history. Next week and stuff, you're going to get into the chapter 2, which is actually going to be to try to install this, okay, and learn about the installation. Remember, at the end of chapter 1, you're going to have some review questions, all right, little short answers, multiple choice. Let's see how many of them are. Oh, look, there's only 15 of them. Okay, again, these are not homework. Your homework is the study guides in Canvas, okay? But these questions here could be fair game on any midterm or final, okay? So I hope that kind of helps you, gives you kind of an overall feel for, you know, what this chapter is about. Again, it's pretty introductory, pretty short chapter. You know, I think you'll do well as you kind of go through. So let me go ahead and stop my share, and I'm going to go ahead and stop my recording, and you guys have a great day, okay?